Okay, now apparently I'm going live now on YouTube, which I've only practiced doing once before, so I'm not quite sure if this is going to work. But I intend to do quite a lot of these me directly to camera um, talks by way of explanations about some of my books, well, from here on in anyway. And the book that's just come out is called Strange Fate, and I wrote it with co-author Jodie Russell. It's briefly said, it's an exciting, extraordinary adventure whilst the two of us investigate a 19th century secret society that had this relic called the Heart of the Rose, which was a small stone carved into the shape of a heart, which was a few thousand years old, so this group believed. And around 1900, they hid it. They believed it had mysterious supernatural powers that could alter fate itself. They hid it, left a series of clues to where it was, and Jodie and I decided not only to investigate this mysterious group that hid this stone, but go in search of the relic. Right. Okay, now I'm going to be giving quite a few of these talks about it. You can buy our book, Strange Fate, on amazon.co.uk or amazon.com. So just look for Strange Fate by Graham Phillips and Jodie Russell. Okay, so let me just explain a background to this. It's all about what you would call, or what is being called, psychic questing. Now, what exactly is that? Or just questing? Because often psychic doesn't even come into it. Basically, right, what is it? It started back in 1979 when myself and Andrew Collins, who many of you know, also an author of books about historical mysteries, were working for a magazine based in Wolverhampton in the centre of England, and the magazine was called Strange Phenomena. We'd investigated paranormal cases, but we also investigated historical mysteries. And one of these was the story of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, in the 1500s, that's Shakespeare's time, to people who don't really know too much about history, in Shakespeare's time, what happened was that Mary, Queen of Scots was executed in Britain. She'd fled from Scotland. She came to see her cousin Elizabeth, hoping she would save her from the rebels. Basically, she locked her up, and sometime later, I think it was 16 years later, she had her executed. But anyway, she was said to have possessed this silver ring with a green stone in it. Now, there's paintings of her with it on. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in the 1580s at Fotheringay Castle in the east of England, the equivalent of a prime minister at the time, a man called Francis Walsingham, ordered that all of Mary, Queen of Scots' personal possessions should be destroyed, so they didn't become like relics to people who followed her and believed that she should be queen. Now, one of these relics was this silver ring with a green stone in it. It disappeared. Nobody ever found it. It was thought to have been given to somebody who had visited her while she was held prisoner, and they hid it. Now, the legend was that a man called Humphrey Packington, who was a friend of hers, so much a friend, a kind of follower, but a very devoted follower of her, who lived in a place called Harvington Hall near the town of Kidderminster, again in central England. He was said to have been the person who had this ring. Apparently, the story is that he took the stone from the ring. The ring eventually, I think, ended up being hidden at the site of Fotheringay Castle near Peterborough in eastern England. And I think somebody found it not so long ago. But the actual stone, which was supposed to have some kind of miraculous powers, although these miraculous powers were never stated, Nobody actually said what they were. He hid this stone and then left a series of clues as to where it was in his home at Harvington Hall, which still survives. It's a huge Elizabethan manor house. And somewhere around 1600, 1605, in that kind of area, he hid this stone. I think it was actually 1605 because it was the year after the gunpowder plot, which was 1604. God, my brain's full of so many dates. Anyway, it's around then, 1605-ish. He hid this stone, and apparently he left somewhere in Harvington Hall, his home, a series of clues as to where it was, so that somebody who came later, who also followed the same series of beliefs as Mary Queen of Scots and Humphrey Packington, could find this stone. Well, it just remained as a legend. But back in 1979, Andrew and I decided what we would do is investigate this story. It made a good, it would make a good story for the magazine. We went to Harvington Hall, and it was a huge, rambling old building with many, many rooms open to the public. Now, there's still a lot of the old furniture still in there. It was quite an incredible place to visit, right in the middle of the countryside. What was fascinating, and this was quite a miraculous timing, when we got there, we were told by one of the guides that something, because I think we said, do you know anything about this legend of Humphrey Packington leaving clues? She said, it's strange you should say that, because recently we were doing renovations to the building, and along an upstairs corridor, a lot of the plaster was removed from the wall, and behind it were found a lot of sealed up paintings, basically wall murals, that were called the Nine Worthies, because they depicted 9 heroic characters from biblical stories, from myth, legend, and from history. In the center of these paintings, there was a young King Arthur wielding Excalibur, and on the hill behind him were gathered his knights. Now, this had only just been found, and they said if there were any clues, for some strange reason, these were bricked up at the time, or at least plastered over, at the time of Humphrey Packington, and have remained so ever since 1605. So this was 1979. So 350 years or thereabouts. These things had remained completely, unknown about. So if there were clues anywhere in the place to where this stone was hidden, and Humphrey Packington had left them, then these may have been it. That this painting, this series of paintings, if you like. So we thought, wow, that's got to be. I mean, they did date from Humphrey Packington's time. It seems that he did commission them. So why board them up? They had no religious context to them particularly. They weren't Packington was a Catholic and the country was Protestant at that point, but there was nothing about this was specifically Catholic. Biblical, yes, to some degree, but not Catholic. So we had nothing to fear from the authorities. So they must have had some purpose. Anyway, eventually, Andrew and I decided that perhaps if there was anything important about these paintings, it might be the central image of Arthur wielding Excalibur. Cutting a long story short, we eventually decided that perhaps this might be something to do, might allude to a nearby landmark. And astonishingly, remember, behind Arthur, there are his knights gathered on a hill. Nearby, there was a place called Knight's Hill, and it had been called that for centuries. Even more fascinating was that just below this hill, there were 2 lakes and a small stream between them, over which was an old bridge called Arthur's Bridge. So basically, there's Arthur's Bridge below Knight's Hill. Arthur's there in front of a hill with his knights gathered on it. So there you go. I mean, we thought, okay, it's got to be there. If this really is a clue to something, that's where we've got to go. Now, at this point, this is purely and simply an historical investigation. I mentioned at the beginning about questing. Some people call it psychic questing, that strange things happen that become involved during the actual research. So this is when this starts to happen. And it was the first time it had ever happened to me or anybody else that I know about. We got a phone call from a guy who was involved with the magazine. He was one of the part-time staff with the magazine. He knew nothing. The only people who knew we were investigating this lost stone and Harvington Hall, well, just Andrew and I, Andy Collins and myself, we're the only people that knew about this. Alan Beard, this guy who phoned us before we left the house, going to have a look at this place called Knight's Hill, he knew nothing about it, what we were doing. He phoned us and he said, "Are you looking for something? I've had a vision of a green stone that was set in an old silver ring." Astonishing. Apparently, he'd been awake, sitting at his desk at work, and this had suddenly come into his head. There's no way he could have known. Back in those days, there was no such thing as mobile phones and computers and cameras on computers that he could have been watching us. I mean, we're talking 1979. It's the Stone Age for you young people today. So there was no way he could have known. But he said he thinks we're looking for something, but it's not a stone at this point, but a sword that will eventually lead us to that stone. And we thought, wow, he said, there's a sword coming to what you're doing. He had no idea we'd been to Harvington Hall and seen the Arthur wielding his sword Excalibur. And he said, I think when you eventually find this sword, there's a big holly bush. I see a big holly bush in my mind. I think that's nearby. But that wasn't the end of it. Just a few minutes later, another lady who was basically with somebody that we'd actually only knew vaguely. We'd met her at a conference to do with UFOs. And she wasn't working for the magazine. She just felt compelled to phone us and tell us that she thought we were searching for something. Well, we hadn't searched for anything before. We'd just investigated the paranormal. But she said, I think you're searching for something. She said, I see a sword that's lying on a slab next to water, a small sword. And she said, I get this overwhelming smell of rotting vegetation nearby. I think you've got to go there. And that was all she got. Apparently she'd fallen asleep in her armchair while watching the TV, and that's what she'd got. So anyway, myself and Andy went out. By the time we left, we were really excited because these two people had completely independently sort of verified psychically, or whatever you want to call it, telepathically, I don't know what you'd say, but somehow had verified that we were looking for something, but maybe it's a sword. The clues in the wall mural were enough to get us excited. But add this to it, we went out to this pool, which is known as Knight's Pool, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the countryside, and it was getting dark by this point. But we were too excited not to keep going. If we'd have found that it had been an island in the middle of the lake, and we thought that might be where it was, we'd have swum out to it in filthy, horrible, dirty water, in basically what was winter. But we didn't have to. We got to the bridge, and the bridge we did discover dates from the early 1600s, when Humphrey Packington may have hidden the stone. And we kind of spent some time thinking, well, if there's a clue in that painting, what does it mean? Well, in the picture, Arthur is standing looking down and to his left, and behind him, over his left shoulder, is the hill with his knights gathered on it. Now, if you stood on the bridge with the Knight's Hill over your left shoulder, then you'd be looking out onto the larger of these two lakes called Knight's Pool. And he's looking down and to his left. I think it was Andy who suggested, well, perhaps it's down there, what we're looking for. Well, that was the foundations of the bridge, all stones which are all overgrown with years of vegetation and brambles and so forth. So we climbed down and around it. Eventually, after some discussion, Again, I think it was Andy who suggested maybe 9 stones along, 9 stones down. If you went 9 stones along and then 9 stones up, you'd end up right at the top of the bridge. But this was right down in the foundations. It seemed like a reasonable place to hide something. So we went down there. When we crept down, we suddenly thought, wow, there's this horrible smell of rotting vegetation, which is what Marion, this lady, had told us in the phone call, where she thought the sword was hidden. We eventually managed to remove one of these stones that was, I don't know, about that big. It was all overgrown. It hadn't been recently moved. It had been there for years. There was moss all over it, in undergrowth, brambles. We managed to remove it, and it was stunning because right there in front of us, behind this stone we'd removed, there was a small ledge, and on top of it, there was laying this short sword. It actually turned out to be something called a dirk, which is a short ceremonial dagger often used in Scotland, and it was an insignia sword used in the Navy on ships, but it was basically a short ceremonial sword, and it was covered in years of silt and sediment, and it had clearly been there for ages. So we took this thing. I mean, I just thought the weird thing, we haven't just solved a series of clues that were left, or this major clue that had been left in an old Elizabethan building. We'd also been guided there by the help of psychics who'd said, 2 of them, who actually hadn't been psychic before, this is the first time they'd ever had any experience like this, they both said that we were looking for a sword, and there it was. They couldn't know where we were going. They hadn't put it there. It had clearly been there for years. So that was quite astonishing that they should have known something that no one alive could have known. You can't talk about telepathy because nobody knew it was there and hadn't done for 350 years, probably. So when we took this out, I then noticed that right above us, the bridge was all overgrown and there was trees growing from it. And there was this great holly bush directly above us, exactly what this guy, Alan Beard, had told us. So we'd got we'd found a sword. It was lying on a stone, like Marion had said. There was this rotting smell of rotting vegetation. There was a holly bush there, and we'd found a sword like they thought. We eventually took this sword to a museum. It was cleaned up. It was found to have on it the coat of arms of Mary, Queen of Scots, and along the blade there was an inscription. But I won't go into all that. This then led us to find this green stone, but that's another story. And if you want to know all about that, you can either read my book that I wrote with Martin Keatman called The Green Stone, which you can get on Amazon, or you can, if you don't want to do that, somewhere amongst all my YouTube videos, there is a video called The Green Stone. It's in short films that I've made. It's called The Green Stone. It's about half an hour long, tells you the whole story. But the reason I've mentioned this, that this was the first example, if you like, that I know of anyway, so certainly the first that I've ever been involved in it, and a quest, what we call a quest, or a psychic quest. Because so what is a psychic quest? Basically, it is when you go in search of an historical artifact or in search of answers to an historical mystery, and along the way, fate, circumstances, or people's intuition or psychic messages, whatever you want to call it, help you along. So that is what psychic questing is. I mean, I wrote another book about psychic questing, or questing, as people like to say. I should just use that word in future, because psychic stuff doesn't always come into it. Sometimes you get strange coincidences. I mean, when I was once searching for, I was doing a book about William Shakespeare, nothing paranormal or anything like that about his private life. And I wanted something to prove. I mean, I knew from a lot of documentation that Shakespeare, I'm not saying somebody else wrote his plays, it wasn't about that, but it was that he wasn't recognized as a playwright. It wasn't considered important while he lived in Stratford. He was just considered to be a businessman. And he actually made his money selling malt, grain, barley to the brewery industry. He was a dealer in bagged commodities. That's how he made his money, not from plays. Now, I'm not saying he didn't write his plays. I'm just saying he wasn't appreciated for writing them while he was alive. And I needed something to prove this. And one time I was going past a library in Stratford upon Avon, and it was just a small library. It wasn't a major place where you do research. And suddenly this little old man, there's quite a few little old men keep coming into this thing. I will be a little old man myself soon. But this guy was scurrying along like the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland with his watch. Oh, I'm going to be late. I'm going to be late. And he turned to me and he says, "Come in here, follow me, follow me." Now he was clearly, getting on a bit. And he said, "Well, come here." So I said, "Are you all right, sir?" He said, "Yeah, come. I've got to show you something." So I thought, well, to keep the man happy, I was going to perhaps say to somebody, "Is he with you? Is he okay?" Followed him in. He just went into the corner, pulled out a book, which was a copy, a modern copy of an old book written in the 1600s called Antiquities of Warwickshire. He opened it, pointed to a picture, which is of Shakespeare's tomb. And he just said, "Oh." And then he just looked at me and said, "You all right, sir?" I said, "Yeah, you okay?" He said, "Yes," and just walked off. I mean, don't ask me what that was all about, but it turned out that this picture in this book showed Shakespeare's tomb before the one we know now, which shows him depicted with a pen in his hand writing on a parchment. This showed the original one before the original one decayed and had to be replaced in the 1700s. The original one showed Shakespeare with his hands on a sack, a malt sack. When people had these busts put above their graves, they depicted their trade. He wasn't originally depicted as an author. He was depicted as a dealer in bagged commodities, which is exactly what he was. So that proved, or was a big part of proving, that the people of Stratford did not appreciate the fact or even recognize the fact that he was a playwright when he was alive. And I would never have found this particular book or even thought about that at that time anyway, if it wasn't for this little old man suddenly, I don't know, going off on a bit of a whatever he went off on. So you get things like that. You also get coincidences, what they call synchronicities, coming into it. So all this is questing. When you're on an historical investigation or searching for an historical artifact, and these various psychic things or strange, helpful synchronicities come into it, that's what questing is. You can't sort of say, right, I'm going to investigate this and I'm going to go on a quest. It kind of either happens or it doesn't. But it's happened to loads of people. There's been quite a few books and pamphlets and booklets written about it since 1979. Andrew Collins wrote quite a few books about various quests involving this kind of thing that didn't have anything to do specifically with the Me and Aya group. That's the people we were investigating that had this sword. Had nothing to do with it. And anyway, I wrote 2 books about that same mystery back in 79, 80. But since then, all the books I've written about have been straightforward historical books. There may have been weird psychic and mystical and serendipitous things happening to help me along, but I don't put all that in the books. But over the last couple of years, Jodie, Russell, and myself have been involved in the search for this stone heart relic that is called the Heart of the Rose, and investigating this mystical Victorian group that met at a place called Biddulph Grange in north central England. And during this time, so many weird things began to happen. I mean, everything from, well, basically, I'll be talking about that in a future one of these things. But I just wanted you to know, first of all, what questing actually is. And Strange Fate is a book all about questing that's happened over the last couple of years while we searched for this lost relic, which was quite remarkable. Anyway, that's it. I'm hoping this thing will work. In the future, what I'm going to do is to schedule in advance when I'm going to do it, so more people can watch me live. Some people are watching. Let's see, they've sent a few messages. One guy says Finchingfield Church has only one design at the end of an arch of all its arches, which is a bull. Oh, marvelous. I'm afraid I don't know what that is. But Andy, he says his name is. Just leave another message under when I put this up on Facebook to keep and explain what you mean. Maybe it's somewhere I went. I can't remember. Space Cadet Lottie says, hi, Graham. Hope you're well, sir. I am very well, as you can see, but getting older. And Got Milk says, we'll have to catch this later as currently at work, but love learning about the Greenstone and later happenings around your office, etc. Fascinating stuff. Thank you all for that. But I will advertise, promote the next one either on my Facebook and stuff, and also schedule it on YouTube if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.